To make a donation, visit biblicallycorrectpodcast.org/donate. And if you enjoy this episode, please like, share, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Thank you for your support. This is the right way to say Yeshua. Welcome to the Biblically Correct Podcast. Shalom, y'all. This is the Biblically Correct Podcast, teaching biblical correctness in a biblically incorrect world. My name is Geoffrey. I am a Jewish follower of the Messiah Yeshua, Jesus, and I love teaching the Scriptures. When I speak the name of the Messiah, I say Yeshua, not Jesus. Not because there's anything theologically or linguistically wrong with the name Jesus, but because Jesus isn't his name, and the name Yeshua has a very specific meaning. I taught about all this at length way back in episode 2, where I explained that the Hebrew Yeshua means salvation, or he saves, which is exactly how it's defined in Matthew 1:21. And you will call his name Yeshua, for he will save his people from their sins. So my choice to call him Yeshua rather than Jesus isn't so much a rejection of the name Jesus and any baggage that comes with it from Christianity, as it is a complete embracing of the true biblical Jewish Messiah. I call him what his family, friends, enemies, and disciples called him. And while some will claim that saying Yeshua instead of Jesus is weird, you don't need to speak someone's native language in order to call him by his given name. What is weird, however, is that some believers who prefer to not call him Jesus don't even call him Yeshua, but instead call him Yahshua or Yahushua or some other kind of linguistically incoherent pseudo-Hebrew. And I don't say that to make fun, but to be honest with you. I know that some of you who say it this way are doing it out of a place of true sincerity. I believe that. And maybe you've just been misinformed. But if we're constraining ourselves to what's been preserved and transmitted to us in the Hebrew manuscripts of the Bible, and we should, as well as holding to the rules and natural understanding of language, then the only pronunciation of the Savior's name is Yeshua. Written in English, either with a Y-E or Y', these two being pretty close to the same thing. So today, I want to show you, from the Hebrew, how we know without a doubt that this is how Yeshua's name is pronounced. And not just because it's good and proper to pronounce it correctly, but because you need to know the truth. Because the reason some believers think it needs to be pronounced differently reflects certain false beliefs about the Bible and the nature of the Messiah, and these false beliefs need to be confronted. But before I get to the Hebrew, let's first consider why, despite the biblical evidence, some believers instead insist upon using a name like Yahshua. Well, it's because some believe that the Messiah's name must somehow contain the sacred name of God, meaning the four-letter name Yud-He-Vav-He, which many believe should be pronounced Yahweh. And this name is supposed to then inform the allegedly correct pronunciation of the beginning of Yeshua's name, instead as Yahshua or the like. But why do they believe that this is the case? Well, for starters, it comes from, frankly, a nonsensical interpretation of John 5:43, where Yeshua says, "I have come in the name of my Father." Now, I talked about this concept of doing something in someone's name in the last episode about pronouncing the sacred name of God. And if you haven't seen that episode yet, you'll definitely want to check that out, because it has a lot of foundational material in it that relates directly to today's topic. But in that episode, I talked about how someone's name has to do with his reputation or authority. So when Yeshua says he's come in his Father's name, what it means is that he's come in his Father's authority. But where the interpretation gets wacky is that some will say that Yeshua coming in the Father's name means that the Father's name needs to be in Yeshua's. That the reason Yeshua has authority is supposedly because the Father's name is literally in his name. So if the Father's name is Yah something or other, then it is supposedly in Yeshua's name correctly as Yahshua, or something that starts with Yah. And this, of course, makes no sense at all. Because one, that's not what John 5:43 says on its face. Two, it's a totally illogical conclusion, accomplished simply by mixing the words of the sentence around and changing the meaning of the word in. And three, the concept that part of your name needs to contain Yah or Yahu in order to have authority from God is in clear contradiction of the scriptures, such as Luke 10:19, where Yeshua says to his disciples, most of whom don't have Yah in their names, "Look, I have given you the authority to tread on serpents and scorpions and on all the power of the enemy, and nothing by any means will hurt you." So that whole line of reasoning that says that the Father's name needs to be in Yeshua's name is simply absurd and untrue. The other reason why some believe that his name isn't Yeshua but Yahshua or similar is based on the mistaken belief that the Jewish medieval scribes, the Masoretes, who gave us the vowel pointing system that preserved the pronunciation of biblical Hebrew, that they purposely and nefariously obscured the sacred name of God in order to keep a tradition that forbids it from being pronounced. I discussed this accusation at length again in the previous episode. And not only did the Masoretes allegedly attempt to hide the correct pronunciation of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, but they also supposedly did this for any Hebrew name that begins with a derivation of the sacred name, especially Joshua. Yeshua then gets roped into this plot because of the fact that it, in turn, comes from Joshua, which I'll explain in a minute. So the thinking goes, if the correct pronunciation of Joshua has been purposely messed with, then so has Yeshua. I mean, do you think it's a coincidence that Joshua sounds like Yahshua? The whole thing has about the same level conspiracy theory vibe as the idea that Jesus comes from Zeus. Have you heard that one? Also totally untrue, completely without any historical or linguistic basis. So with that background out of the way, let's take the remainder of this teaching to unpack the biblical Hebrew a bit and see if we can determine what the correct pronunciation of Yeshua actually is. And we'll start with the word Yasha. Yasha is a verb that simply means to save, and it consists of the letters Yud, Shin, and Ayin. Now, Yasha is what they call a primitive root of several other Hebrew words, one of them being the name Hosea or Hosea, which means salvation. Hosea is spelled He, Vav, Shin, Ayin, inheriting the letters Shin and Ayin from Yasha. Also descended from Yasha is the noun Yeshua. Sound familiar? Which also means salvation. We see this word in passages such as Exodus 15:2. My strength and song is Yah, which is a shortened form of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, and he became my salvation, my Yeshua. Yeshua is spelled Yud, Shin, Vav, Ayin, He, inheriting all the letters of Yasha. But let's set aside Yeshua for a minute and go back to Hosea. Hosea is an important name in our discussion because it's from this name that we get the name Joshua, or in Hebrew, Yehoshua. In Numbers 13:16, the Torah says, "And Moshe called Hosea, son of Nun, Yehoshua." So this is where the name Joshua, or Yehoshua, comes from. Moses gave it to him. So how does Yehoshua then relate to Hosea? And this is probably the key to unraveling this whole mystery. Yehoshua, which is spelled Yud, He, Vav, Shin, Ayin, is a combination of two Hebrew names. The first is Hosea, which can be easily seen in the name Yehoshua. They share the exact same letters in the exact same order, He, Vav, Shin, Ayin. The second name that Yehoshua comes from is the Tetragrammaton, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, the so-called personal name of God. So the Yud from Yud He Vav He is appended to the front of Hosea, making the name Yehoshua. Hosea means salvation, and Yehoshua, by appending the Yud to the front of Hosea, makes it mean Yud He Vav He is salvation, or Yud He Vav He saves. So there's no doubt that the name Joshua, Yehoshua, absolutely contains the name of Yud He Vav He, as represented by the addition of the Yud. Where things go off the tracks, however, is that some people look at Yehoshua and say, look, the first three letters of Yehoshua are Yud, He, and Vav, which are also the same first three letters of Yud He Vav He. This means that the correct pronunciation of Yehoshua is actually Yahushua or Yahushua or some such thing, believing that this is the correct pronunciation of the first three letters of the sacred name. But there are two significant problems with this conclusion. The first is that in order to produce a different pronunciation for Yehoshua, you have to disregard the pronunciation that was preserved for us in its vowel points, the lines and dots in and around the Hebrew letters. You have to call into question the trustworthiness of the Masoretic texts that undergird our entire Hebrew Bibles. But even if it were true that the Masoretes totally conspired with each other to obfuscate the sacred name, the second problem is that you'd also have to ignore the linguistics of how the name Yehoshua is actually formed. While some will misconstrue what they read in the lexicons and think that Yehoshua comes directly from smashing Yud He Vav He together with the primitive root Yasha, that's just not what happened here. As I've shown you, Yehoshua comes from adding the Yud from Yud He Vav He to Hosea. It's an obvious linguistic fact that you have to completely ignore in order to isolate the Shin and Ayin root of Hosea and appropriate the He and Vav for the sacred name. The point is, Yehoshua's name is pronounced Yehoshua, exactly as it's written in the Hebrew. So what then does all this mean for the name Yeshua? Well, first of all, we know it's definitely a biblical name. We find several different historical figures who share the name, as recorded in the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. We also know that it appears to have been eventually used as an abbreviated form of the name Yehoshua, Joshua, as indicated by Nehemiah 8:17 and elsewhere. Additionally, the Greek transliteration of Yeshua, used throughout the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, is also how Joshua's name is represented. Presumably for linguistic reasons, someone decided somewhere along the way that both Yeshua and Joshua should be transliterated the same in Greek. This is why Jesus and Joshua in the New Testament share the identical Greek name, Jesus. And to be a little more on the nose, this also explains why in English, Joshua is typically Joshua and not Jehoshua. Now, does all this mean that Yeshua's name is actually Joshua or Yehoshua? It's relatively certain that it's not, based on a number of things. The way Yeshua was used by that time in Israeli history, the God-breathed representation of Yeshua's name in the Greek scriptures, and especially the way the New Testament itself defines Yeshua's name, not as Yud He Vav He will save, but as He, meaning Yeshua, will save. To say that Yehoshua has to be Yeshua's true original name would be like saying that anyone who is given the name Fred at birth has to really be Frederick, or anyone who's named Luke is really Lucas. Fred and Luke are legitimate names in their own right, despite being derived from Frederick and Lucas. And it's the same with Yeshua. But all that being said, for our purposes right now, the point is that there's no doubt that at some time in Israel's history, Yeshua became an accepted abbreviation for Yehoshua. And the primary thinking on this is that Yeshua was derived as a contraction of Yehoshua. Let's look again at the Hebrew. Yehoshua again is Yud He Vav Shin Ayin, for almost every occurrence of Joshua in the Hebrew Scriptures. Twice, however, it's spelled with an extra vav to create the shu sound that's usually accomplished by the sheen with an u vowel pointing. When we line this version of Yahushua up with Yeshua, then we can easily see what would be removed to complete the contraction. By taking out the syllable ho and contracting what's left, we get Yeshua, Yud, Shin, Vav, Ayin. But wait, you might say. You said that the Yud comes from Yud-He Vav-He, and when the name was contracted, the Yud still remained. So the name of Yeshua does contain the Father's name after all, and we should restore the pronunciation to Yahshua. Well, not so fast. While there's certainly some validity to the idea of Yud-He Vav-He still being preserved in the name Yeshua, that still doesn't affect the pronunciation of what we clearly see in the Hebrew. But in addition to that, there's one more important piece of evidence we need to consider. Because on one hand, while Yeshua appears to be a contraction of Yehoshua, which comes from Hosea, which comes from Yasha, on the other hand, notice something interesting here. Yeshua, being a linguistic descendant of Yasha through Yehoshua, also contains all three of Yasha's letters, Yud, Shin, and Ayin. And this should come as no surprise, because Yeshua also contains all the letters of the Hebrew word Yeshua. Remember from earlier? It contains all the letters except for the final he, which simply indicates it's the feminine form of the word. The proper name Yeshua is Yud, Shin, Vav, Ayin, and the noun Yeshua is Yud, Shin, Vav, Ayin, He. So while Yeshua appears to be a contraction of Yehoshua, it's most certainly the exact same word, for all intents and purposes, as the Hebrew word for salvation, Yeshua, which is completely unrelated etymologically to Yah or Yud-He Vav-He. So when it comes to the pronunciation of Yeshua, we find that there's no legitimate route for it to pick up the Yah sound. From the contraction standpoint, it's pronounced exactly like you'd expect when you take the ho out of Yehoshua, Yeshua. But if you're still at all suspicious that the Masoretes fiddled with the pronunciation of Yehoshua, all you have to do for the pronunciation of Yeshua is to also look to its feminine counterpart, Yeshua. If the Masoretes were trying to obscure the sacred name, they would have had no reason whatsoever to modify the Hebrew word for salvation, where again, it and its root Yasha has literally nothing at all to do with Yud-He Vav-He. So no matter which path you take, the end result is the same. The Messiah's name is pronounced Yeshua, which means not Yah is salvation, but He is salvation, as evidenced again by Matthew 1:21, you will call His name Yeshua, for He will save His people from their sins. The Master was called Yeshua exactly because of what He would do in the name of the Father, not because the name of the Father needs to be in the name of the Son. Don't get roped into false beliefs and nonsensical pronunciations that have no legitimate basis in the Scriptures. Instead, be confident and content to call upon Yeshua, and by His name, you will be saved. Thanks for joining me for the Biblically Correct podcast. If you like this episode, please support us by making a donation. And don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe, and ring the bell to receive notifications of new episodes. Until next time, remember that every scripture is God-breathed. Shalom.